Good morning, all.
Good morning.
And I got to tell you, for me, it's a pleasure to be here. Now, you might say to yourself, why is this guy's got a smile on his face? He was on dialysis since 2012. He received a transplant in 2017. That's 3 years ago. So shouldn't he be thinking, you know what, the most likely time that it's most mentioned that your kidney that you received is going to let you know, is it going to last? Is it with you for life? It's usually within the first 3 years. I think Dr. Mucsi will probably agree there. Because I've seen some patients receive the kidney and sometimes a year, 2 years, 3 years, it's gone. Well, I'm still there. And you might say, well, don't smile yet. Wait maybe 4, 5, 7 years and then celebrate. But no, you know what? I'm going to celebrate now because things I learn here at UHN is they're always trying to do something and things to improve the lifestyle of patients. And of course, they're a teaching school institution, a teaching hospital. So we'll expect that, but they do a fine job. Do you know, my brother had a heart condition out in Mississauga. And they had to fly him here by a helicopter because they couldn't take care of him. So he landed on the roof here at Sick Kids. This was a few years ago. And my mother came down as well, too. And she says, this little doctor, a very short little lady, she says, not to worry, I'll take care of it. In the meantime, my mother can hear them saying, you know what, he's might be gone. You know, and she goes, no, bring him in. Let's take him in there. They operated, and today he's still alive. So what they do here is absolutely great. But anyways, my story, I backtracked, and I find it started off way back in 1987. There's some pictures here. You probably wonder, what the heck are those pictures there for? He's talking about a kidney. I'll explain that later, because it's all part of why I'm smiling. Okay, so in '87, things started happening that the family doctor couldn't figure out what it could be. Most of the time, he'd give me a prescription and say, hey, this is going to take care of it. It could be a case of urinary tract infection. But all that time, things just started to get worse and worse until the kidney stone developed in '87. So then I went to Scarborough General Hospital. It was called Scarborough General at the time. And they said, okay, let's take a look. They said, okay, it's a stone. It's on its way down, and that's what's causing the pain. I said, okay, sure. All right, so go home, let it pass, and then we'll analyze the stone when you come back in. So they analyze the stone. They say, just stay away from those Haagen-Dazs. You love them too much. You know, so I did that. But that was all they told me. If I came to UHN, I'm pretty sure they would have given me some a dietary plan or something. But anyways, I was satisfied with that. Years went on, things still started happening. You know, I was getting swelling knees, you name it. So I suffered with a lot of things since '87. Then come the failure in 2012. After returning from Vancouver, 2011, my wife says, boy, we had a lot of fun in Vancouver. We got to go back in 2012. I said, no problem at all. Let's start making the arrangements. Then June 25th, I ended up in emergency. And turns out to be, now the kidneys are gone. But what happened in that time before they actually failed in 2012? Well, I was on a really nice, strong dose of Naproxen, 500 milligrams twice a day. And then later I discovered Naproxen is not good for you. So why did the family doctor give me Naproxen? Okay. Anyways, that's my fault because Google was around in 2012 and I should have checked what Naproxen could, the adverse, effect of naproxen. I should have checked it. Anyways, so I come into Toronto General Emergency. They get me going and said, okay, you're not leaving here because you're going to have to stick around for a while. You've also got a stomach ulcer, likely caused by the naproxen, because you're supposed to drink a lot of water with it. And I didn't know. I was just taking it normally. Anyway, so that was taken care of. And then this is when the feeling started setting in. You know, that kind of upset feeling, okay? I wasn't smiling anymore. And so one day, they had to call a code 1 on me. Can you believe it? This same guy. I mean, look at me here. Do I look like a person who would generate a code 1? Oh, sir, not code blue, code 1.
Code white.
Oh, code white, yeah. When security shows up, right?
Yeah.
Do I look like that kind of guy? Honestly. No, right? Okay. But yeah, they did. Because I got this feeling like, you know what? The world is against me. Why is this happening to me? I want to go back to Vancouver. We want to visit Tofino again and go on the island. Oh, this can't be happening. I got too many things to do. I got projects to work on. At the time, I was working for IBM. So I had to leave all of that behind, and you start thinking of your career and everything, and it's like, wow, what happened, you know? I'm going to be on dialysis Monday, Wednesday, Friday. What am I going to do? So Monday, dialysis, Tuesday, recovery, Wednesday, dialysis, Thursday, recovery, Friday, dialysis, Saturday, and then Sunday, church, or struggle to get into church. You see, so you get this feeling. But then I met Dr. Scoli and people like Dr. Mucsi, who actually, when they come to see you in dialysis, they give you a comfortable feeling. It kind of started with Dr. Scoli because he's from Vancouver, and I told him all about my trips to Vancouver, and would get into discussions about salmon and salmon fishing and the different types of salmon, like marble salmon. Have you ever heard of marble salmon? Probably not. I didn't until I went to Vancouver. See, what gives salmon that color is the krill. It looks like a little tiny shrimp. But true wild salmon don't get the krill every day. And so what happens? They look like a block of marble cheddar cheese, you know, with that orange and right speckles. And so that's when things started turning around for me. I started to feel a lot better. And then you would think, okay, this guy, he's turning around, and I didn't expect this at all. You look at that picture. Now, you notice a sketch picture in the background of me. And the reason I wanted to share that with you is because it was actually sketched by one of the dialysis nurses. She didn't have to do it. She didn't do it on her work time. She did it on her off time. Okay? And then putting the words together was done by all the nurses. So not just one nurse. And I'll just scroll down a little bit so you can actually see what the words were that they used. By the way, the presentation was going to be about 30 minutes, but I had to shorten it really quick. As you could see, I just skipped by all that stuff because I've only got 10 minutes, and I hope I'm within my 10 minutes. So that's what they presented me on my birthday, March 27th, 2017. And then, just a close-up of the words. I'll give you just a quick moment to read that. Now, you see, how could you not love going in for dialysis treatment after you receive something like that? I'm not Brad Pitt. I'm not even close to George Clooney. But the kind of respect I received when I went in there was that. Now, how did that come about? And I'm not Brad Pitt or George Clooney. You know what it was? It was not not being upset at what's wrong with you, but work with the doctors, work with the nurses, because they're there to help you. They're there to make you better. And I think what happens, as I looked at the other patients, the ones getting angry, yelling at the staff and all sorts of things, when I speak to them individually on their own, it's not that they truly were upset with the staff. It's how they felt. It's how they felt, and by taking it out on the staff, it made them feel better. But that's counterproductive. I know, well, still know, one patient who received a transplant and wanted to end it all. So why do you, I mean, in your own little mind, you're not a dialysis patient, but what do you think? What would make him want to do that after going through all that dialysis and then want to have that thing removed and just jump? He said he wanted to jump. And I sat back for a little while and I thought about it, and I said, you know what? You said you love being godfather. How would those little ones feel when they walk up to your casket and they ask, what happened to him? And they're going to get a simple story because they're young, but eventually when they grow up, they're going to know the truth. And you know what? I don't think they're going to be very happy. So that, with the treatment he's receiving here, actually changed things. And it got out of his mind. He's doing volunteer things now. He even appears on Chin Radio. He was there last Friday, and Monday. And I was one of the patients who called in. And the radio station was just delighted because I told them my story, how I ended up losing my kidneys. And actually people started phoning in and asking about what Naproxen could do. And they wanted more information. I said, you know what, you would also, I don't know if it's fair to say that. Nah, I can't, I don't think so. Maybe illegally I can't mention the name in the drugstore, but it's a painkiller that has this Naproxen in it, but it's the milligrams, it's not the danger part. It's below, I think it's like 200 milligrams, and that's kind of, well, they say safe, but over a long period it's not going to be. But anyway, so I mentioned that, and people started phoning in, and they Google it, and they found, it can cause some serious effects. So I had to keep this to 10 minutes. I didn't get a chance to basically include all I wanted. There's one of the things I wanted to say, though. And basically, I wanted to share with the world on how dialysis can become actually a fun thing. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Okay? It should be like a sentence, but not really. Now, here's another picture. There's the gift that Brad Pitt would receive. And this cup and the book were received by two individuals that work for UHN that has nothing to do with dialysis or kidneys. They actually work in this section that, maybe I could say this part, analyze tissue. Yeah, that's probably as far as I can go with that. The rest is private. But yeah, see, this one here is based on a book, a movie called, wait a minute. Yeah, it's a movie called The Adjustment Bureau. And in this movie, they use a book to chronologic items and things that's going to happen in the future. So she told me, when I get started, make sure I document everything in this book and then put it to computer. And ironically, just happens to be what Dr. Mucsi is doing. So a lot of it's going to go in here. And then the cup was designed by the other UHN workers. This is what she does for her hobby. She makes cups. And she wants me to use this cup until I can't be myself anymore. And so that's the cup I use for everything, even a nice glass of cold wine. So, and I think that's it to keep my 10 minutes. Oh, yeah, and this is the stickers. Everybody wanted to put stickers all over this picture. I took them off the front, and basically I couldn't even see the picture because there were stickers all over the place. But this one I love very much because it's my mustache, you know. And I think, oh yeah, and here's another one she did for another colleague of mine. And he's a very good guy. And I think that's about it. I had to keep it short. Like I said, this would have run about half an hour. And so I just thought I'll just share the really important parts with you. I'm very happy to participate in this project that Dr. Mucsi and the organization is running or organizing. And I think if we can get the word out there, you see this part up here where I started in 1987 with a kidney stone? See, there was more than just a kidney stone when that all happened. There was little things going on, but it eventually developed into a kidney stone. Wouldn't it be nice if we can help people in the future recognize early signs of kidney failure instead of waiting for it to fail, become CKD, and then you end up on dialysis? I think from when I trace back my journey, I believe before 87, if certain things could have been spotted there and say, hey, you know what, that's a kidney onslaught coming, I think I could avoid that thing there in 2012. And I would have been relaxing in Tofino and not sitting on the dialysis bed. So let's push this project forward and get it out there into the communities. And I think we'd be able to prevent 1987 from occurring for a lot of people out there. Thank you very much. Hopefully I didn't go past my 10 minutes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction and creating the context of kidney disease. So I guess although we are talking at the other end of the journey, we're talking about the transplant and how can we get a transplant, but I think it is absolutely essential, and we need to remember that pretty much every time when we talk about this, that journey starts somewhere, and frequently that is potentially preventable. And in addition to talking to people who have kidney disease already, we as a society in general, we need to know more about what causes kidney disease. How can we prevent? How can we prevent that equally? Because again, the other thing that we will be talking about, that access to care is not necessarily the same for everybody, not equitable. It's not distributed across society equitably, and preventing kidney disease is also not equitable. So we are talking, and we need to focus because we cannot really do everything at the same time. And right now, we try to focus on providing the best care or making the best potential care available for everybody who needs it, and that is living donor kidney transplant. But also we need to make sure that we think about the beginning of that journey with kidney disease, and try to make sure that information about kidney disease, what can be done about it, how can it be prevented or slowed down, is again readily available for everybody who needs it. So I think it is important, and yes, so kidney disease is very traumatic, and it's very frequently mobilizes energies that are not necessarily good, because it taps into fears, depression, anxieties, and we are not really paying too much attention to that. And we talk about transplant, and we really think that kidney transplant is the best treatment for kidney failure. But we also need to remember that it is a surgery, it is a change in life, it is moving away from that dialysis family where you feel that you belong to, because you go there 3 times a week if you go to in-center dialysis. And changing that to transplant, where initially you are very busy in the hospital, but then you are left alone on your own, can be quite traumatic. So those are aspects of kidney disease that need attention as well. But this is not quite what I will be talking about right now. We will talk about equitable access and how the current action project that we are doing in partnership with the Black Health Alliance and with the community tries to focus on understanding disparities. It is done in a research framework, and quickly I will touch upon some of the research studies that are related. And then talk a little bit about health equity in general, and then we will show some data from our research. Noor, one of our research associates, will present some of the results. Again, hopefully that will be thought-provoking, and at the end, Lydia-Joi will discuss and describe the most recent stage of where the research is. So I want to then bring in why do we think inequity and disparities in accessing kidney transplant is important. It's a big question and big problem. The magnitude is significant. We'll show you data about that, and we'll try to start discussing about what are the factors there and how can we change it. So we have the three speakers. We have disclosures here which are not necessarily related to how much money we get from this pharmaceutical company or that, which frequently is a potential conflict for medical research. Because we are talking about a specific aspect of research, and that is ethnic, cultural, racial equity or racial identities. It is very important for us to recognize what may be our biases that come from the fact who we are. I'm a Hungarian. I'm a white physician. I'm a Hungarian physician by origin, coming from Europe, and I bring a lot of knowledge and a lot of ways of understanding with me that is described with these facts, and some of those ways of understanding are biased and sometimes are heavily biased, and I'm frequently not really aware of those biases, and I think reflecting on that is quite important. And I think the next speakers, as we go, will reflect on their biases, because we all have that. It's not that it's necessarily bad. It's bad until we know about them, because once we know, then we can start to reflect and maybe change if we are open to. So what are the research frameworks that this whole project and set of projects are embedded in? We have been, starting in 2014, have been interested in understanding ethnocultural barriers to transplant. And the reason it started is when I came to UHN in that year, talking to the leadership at the multi-organ transplant program, it was obvious that living donor transplant is an interest for the program. We need to improve there. And then talking to others, some of my colleagues at Sick Kids pointed out that it seems that people who come from racialized or minority communities, children, may not be able to get a living donor transplant as quickly as white children. And the reasons are not really well researched, not understood, and there are no programs addressing those issues. And from that, I started to build a research program that looks at psychosocial and ethnocultural barriers to living donor kidney transplant, focusing on all the major communities that I was aware from the literature at that point, that is East Asians, South Asians, and the Black community here in Toronto. We are building a big database from all the research projects that we are conducting in other directions as well, to combine the data so that we can have analysis later on. And lastly, this summer, as Paula mentioned, we received some funding to look at access to kidney transplant in the Black community here in Ontario, in partnership with Dr. Gill in Vancouver, whose team is trying to understand barriers that the South Asian community there faces. So I don't really want to spend too much time on the research framework anymore. I will let the numbers and Lydia-Joi speak for what we are doing within that project. But what this project is aiming to understand We know that there are disparities in access to transplant, and we try to understand why that is. Why is that if you're coming from one of these communities, your chance to have a living donor transplant is 50 to 70% less than if you're coming from a white background. In addition to understanding the reasons, or these facts and the reasons, in this project, in the second half of the project, we will try to pilot interventions that we build and co-develop together with the community to see if we can reduce those inequities and if we can support people to think more about how to access living donor transplant and potentially get more transplant. So why is that important? This is where I usually start. Living donor transplant gives you the best results. Mr. Hicks mentioned that the average lifespan of a kidney is limited, and that's true for every kidney. But if you have a living donor transplant, that kidney supposedly on average last many years longer than if you have a deceased donor kidney. And so it is important to understand that the best treatment for kidney failure is really getting a living donor kidney transplant. And where the problem starts, or where this problem that we try to focus on starts, is that if this is the best treatment, then everybody should be able to access this best treatment. And we know from research in the United States and other jurisdictions that if you're black in the US, your chance to get a living donor transplant is much less compared to whites, that is represented by this line, and the blue dots represent the ratio, the proportion of black patients who are able to get a living donor transplant compared to whites. This is the blue dots. And as you see that between 1995 and 2014 or so, the gap, the difference between black and white patients in the US has not been reduced. In fact, it has become even more visible, more clear. It has become bigger. And of course, it's not only the US that has problems with this. In Canada, Indigenous peoples have similarly reduced chance to get a living donor transplant compared to the white patients here in orange. Indigenous patients in green, hiding here behind this black line and the blue line, diabetic Indigenous patients have much less chance to receive a living donor transplant, again, compared to whites. Similarly to Indigenous patients, patients with East or South Asian background have 50 to 70% less chance to get living donor transplant. That was known and that was published, that was researched in 2007. More than 10 years ago, and one would think that something was done about it. And it seems that it wasn't. It wasn't sufficient, because when we looked at our data more recently here at UHN, we saw the same picture compared to white patients in the dotted line. South Asian, East Asian, and black patients had at least 50% less chance to get a living donor transplant. Why that is, we don't know, and this is what we would like to understand. But it is complicated, and this slide just kind of leads the way of why is it that numbers alone will not be able to answer this. Because we think when we are talking about transplant and kidney disease, we're talking about the health issues, the data here, and this very complex system that we have around us. We physicians in research, we like to focus about hard outcomes, hospital admission, death, mortality, or other numerically expressed outcomes. But what is important is really the mechanisms what are behind those outcomes. And just the numbers will not give the answers, because where this whole thing starts is really the basic structure of a society, our existence, our identities, and those biases that are mentioned, that are quite deeply ingrained in our identities. They are linked to social institutions, the politics and the economics around us, and very indirectly related to health. And of course, if you're in a racialized community, your identity, your experience of discrimination and racism will form and shape your situation. It is linked to your socioeconomic status, which opens up or not, doesn't open up doors for you through this system, and eventually it will lead to health outcomes, either because you cannot access the care or because your attitudes or health behaviors are not very fitting. But there are additional reasons which we only understand if we start to talk about this, and that's what our current stage of research, when we engage the communities and we try to talk about these issues deeply, hopefully will unearth. At this point, I'll hand over the podium to Noor, who will show some of the quantitative results that we have from our studies.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
Yes? Okay, great. So my name is Noor El-Dassouki. I am a research associate with Dr. Mucsi's team. And I guess just going back to the disclosures, while I don't have any big amounts of funding from pharmaceutical companies to disclose, I do just want to acknowledge the fact that I hold my own privileges and biases that may come into play in the work that I do and in the work that I present to you today. And those privileges, I think, give me a responsibility to make sure that I can amplify the voices of marginalized communities and communities that aren't necessarily given the chance to be heard all the time. So with that, as Dr. Mucsi mentioned, we've been kind of conducting studies with patients who have chronic kidney disease, and we've been recruiting them from dialysis units across Toronto for the last 5 years or so. And we've been asking them to complete questionnaires electronically on a tablet, where they self-report their own kind of demographic information, and they answer some questions around various ethnocultural and psychosocial factors. So I'm going to be presenting kind of some of our preliminary findings from this data, but before I go through those slides, I did want to acknowledge some of the main limitations in our data collection process and in our study as a whole. So some of the main ones that I wanted to point out, first of all, unfortunately, we're unable to include patients who cannot read at a grade 5 level of English because our questionnaires are only available in English at this time. And I think that this is a limitation. At the same time, we do try to account for that by offering these patients the opportunity to participate in individual interviews that are conducted in their language of choice, their preferred language, so that we're able to capture their experience and understand their perspective, and also account for any potential language barriers that might come into play as they're trying to pursue or access transplant. For the patients that we do include in our study, as I mentioned, we ask them to self-identify their ethnicity. And while I think that our ethnic categories that are presented in our questionnaire are quite good, they are not perfect. It's not necessarily an exhaustive list that we present them with, and it's not, it doesn't get to very granular level of data. So because of our relatively small sample size, we oftentimes have to group different ethnicities into broader categories in order to be able to do statistical analyses and to see the trends in the data. But I do want everybody to keep in mind the fact that when we're presenting this data, those broad ethnic groups are very diverse in and of themselves, and they're not homogenous groups as they're presented. And then we have some limitations stemming from the fact that our study is a cross-sectional and convenient sample as well, which is kind of the, less exciting limitations in my view. But with all of that in mind, this table shows a rough breakdown of the patients that are included in our sample. So in total, we had about 600 patients complete our questionnaire to date, with the average age of our patients being around 57 years old and about 60% of our patients being male. So when we looked at the ethnicity of the patients that are included in our sample, we had about 27% of our patients identifying as Black, 7% as East Asian, 17% as South Asian, and 45% as white, with a small percentage identifying with other categories, which include, I guess, anything that doesn't fall within those specific categories. And when you look at patients who are from the different ethnic groups, we did see some significant differences in kind of their characteristics. So, for example, the percentage of patients that are in domestic partnerships, those who have over 12 years of education, those who experience the most material deprivation as defined by the Ontario Marginalization Index. And we also saw some differences in the proportion of patients who had diabetes and those who experienced various or multiple comorbidities along with their kidney disease. So in our questionnaire, we ask patients at the time of their first pre-transplant assessment if they have a potential living donor identified. And a potential living donor can kind of be interpreted as anybody that a patient thinks might step forward to offer to be their living donor. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have actually filled out an application or gone through any evaluation, just somebody that a patient thinks or has offered to be a donor or thinks will potentially pursue that. So the reason that this question is an important question is, and I think we kind of skimmed through that slide, but in a previous study, Dr. Mucsi has shown that patients who do not have a potential living donor identified at this time point at their first pre-transplant assessment are around 85% less likely to actually end up getting a living donor kidney transplant down the road. So it's a really important predictor of actually receiving a living donor kidney transplant. So in this graph, we see the percentage of patients who belong to the different ethnic groups who answered that they did not have a potential living donor identified at this time point. And we see that over 50% of patients who identified as Black, East Asian, or South Asian did not have a potential living donor identified. And when we did some multivariable modeling and adjusted for some confounding factors like age, sex, education, and comorbidities, we saw that patients who were from Black, South Asian, and East Asian communities were between 2 and 5 times less likely to have a potential living donor identified at this time point. And I think this is a significant finding because it means that they will also be a lot less likely to receive a living donor kidney transplant down the road. So in the questionnaire, we also gave patients a set of questions, around 15 or so questions that are transplant knowledge testing questions around kidney transplant specifically. And this set of questions has been created and validated by Dr. Amy Waterman from the UCLA in the US. And when we looked at the overall scores that patients got on this set of questions, we again saw an interesting trend where white patients, a higher proportion of white patients received high scores on this kind of overall test, which is represented by the red bars here. And then patients who were from Black, East Asian, and South Asian communities tended to get lower scores, or a higher proportion of patients from those communities tended to get lower scores. And again, when we looked at a multivariable model where we adjusted for confounders, we did see that ethnic minority patients were much less likely to get a high score on this test. So while these trends do kind of point towards the potential knowledge gaps that may exist in our patient population, when we looked at some of the individual questions that make up this overall score, we saw some interesting trends that might make us kind of second guess that conclusion. So one thing that we saw is that all patients, regardless of their ethnicity, seem to have a strong understanding of some of the key knowledge items as we might consider them. So for example, a significant majority of our patients from all ethnic groups did know that a living donor kidney lasts longer than a deceased donor kidney. They also had a good understanding of the fact that transplant provides better kidney function and longer life than dialysis. So those are, I think, some of the kind of key things that we want patients to understand and have good knowledge about when they're making their decision about transplant or dialysis. We did, however, see that there were some questions that patients had differing views on. So we saw that patients who were from Black, East Asian, and South Asian community felt or thought that rich patients were able to get transplanted more easily than poor patients. And while it is debatable if this is true or not, this would be considered an incorrect answer. But I think it's important to recognize the fact that this trend points to the idea that patients may hold some significant mistrust in the system, where they feel that patients who are rich have easier or quicker access to transplant than poor patients. And I think that this is something that we need to explore and delve into a little bit deeper in our qualitative research, so that we can understand, as much as patients might have the knowledge about transplant being objectively the better option, if they feel that there is an inequity in the system and they don't necessarily trust the system, then that might hinder their interest or their ability to pursue transplant further. So there's a couple other items that we explored with patients, including their readiness to take action towards living donor kidney transplant. So we asked them a few different questions, seeing if they are willing to or have taken certain steps towards living donor transplant, such as sharing their interest in living donor kidney transplant with others, sharing educational materials about living donation with others, or even approaching people in their social networks to potentially consider being a living donor. And we saw similar trends again, where a higher proportion of white patients expressed greater willingness or were more likely to actually have taken these steps compared to patients from Black, East Asian, and South Asian communities, with the adjusted probability being over 50%. So patients who were from these ethnic minority communities were less than 50% as likely as white patients to be willing to or to actually have taken these steps. And again, while this points towards a potential discomfort that our patients might be experiencing in sharing information about living donation or their interest in living donation with others, again, I think it's important for us to explore this in focus groups and understand why patients might not be willing to do these things, and seeing if they are if there are any modifiable factors that we would be able to address. So the last items that I wanted to share are some questions where we ask patients to rate how important certain factors are when they're making a decision about transplant. So we saw some interesting trends here where there were some certain questions that patients, regardless of ethnicity, had shared concerns. So for example, we asked patients if they had any worries about living donors developing health issues because of donation, and we saw that patients, over 90% of patients from all ethnic groups actually shared this as a significant concern when deciding if they wanted to pursue living donor kidney transplant. And this is clearly something that we will need to address with our patients. But we also saw some concerns that were more prominent in certain groups. So when we asked some patients, or we asked all of our patients actually, if they might be worried about having to take medication after transplant, or having to pay for medication after transplant. Also, the worry about the pain that would be experienced through transplant surgery. And we saw that patients, especially from Black and South Asian communities, were much less likely to have this as a prominent concern. And while I don't necessarily have an answer as to why this is, I think we'll have to delve deeper into this in our qualitative research so that we can understand if these concerns are related more to systemic issues like the lack of universal drug coverage, or if they're related more to personal beliefs that patients might hold about what it means for them to be on medication or to be in pain or go through surgery. So with that, I will pass it along to Lydia-Joi Marshall, who is a research associate with our team as well, and she's going to talk a little bit about the qualitative research that we're doing as part of this project.
Okay, so good afternoon. Okay, so we're having a culturally appropriate talk, so as a West Indian woman, I will not continue until I have a proper response. So good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to also give my disclaimer that we gave previously. I'm obviously a racialized woman. I have my own powers and privilege that I sit in. However, I do not represent all those who either look like me or are from marginalized or racialized communities. It does give me my own biases that I stand with, that sometimes I do think that I represent a broader group. However, I do feel responsible to acknowledge that I hold space as someone who is not part of the majority, but do not represent all those who are not. So I'm kind of here to kind of speak about, how are we going to address all these limitations that we spoke about before? We always want to kind of move forward in a positive way. We've looked at the numbers. We've said there are disparities. There are things that are happening, but we do not know why. Numbers alone cannot answer this. So, we've kind of looked and said, why have these questions not been answered before? And there's a number of reasons. One part of his idea that the structures and the way in which you keep investigating, we're doing it in the same way. So we have these same academic and systemic processes that don't account for certain nuances or information that are not collected when you don't speak with people individually. There's systemic problems in the way in which this information is collected, in the way in which it is interpreted. And we know that some of the academic structures that it's worked under were not meant to include diversity and inclusion. This is big buzzwords that we have now, and it's a framework that we use now, but when they were initially put into place, that was not the consideration. So it's something that we have to challenge. A lot of the work that we're doing, that's what it's about. It's about challenging the systems and the ways in which we've been doing things previously so that we can come up with new answers and new ways to look at why are these disparities being seen. Noor went through a few of these of what the limitations are. I want to kind of focus on the idea of the community involvement part of it, because we're looking at studying groups, but yet we're studying them as if we're observing from a distance. We want to get away from the idea that this is like a zoo observation. We need to actually have true and complete partnerships so that those we are studying are part of this. We're not studying them, it is us learning from each other. So we're going to kind of focus on that. So again, this is one of these buzzwords. Everyone says community-led research, community partnership, and we don't often define in our own realms what does that mean? What does that look like in a practical sense? So some of this information is things that we've discovered as we're moving through this process. I'm coming from this lens from community work. As we said, I'm on the board of Black Health Alliance. I'm also coming from basic research, and some of this information is also feedback that we've begun to receive from those we've spoken to in our focus groups. So true community-led research means, that it's a process where community is involved in every step. It's not that once the project's been designed, once the problem's been identified, then you speak with a handful of people that you believe are representative. It's involving everybody at every step of the way, designing what you're looking at, ensuring that this is really reflective of what the community needs and that it can help out everybody at every level. In doing so, we've really discovered that we have to be adaptable in this. A lot of us come from an academic background where we know, this is a scientific process, these are the steps that we take, and this is what it looks like. We have to really kind of humble ourselves to say, but in every community, in every culture, there's a different ways by people communicate with one another. There's a different way that knowledge is disseminated, and it's something that we have to continuously be aware of. For me, even, working in my own various diverse communities within the Black community, I've learned a lot in this of, there's sometimes when you can do the way that you're accustomed, and there's ones that you have to really sit back and allow, how do you build trust? How do you do this process? And you can't just barrel through. There's been a lot of flexibility that's had to happen in our process, and realize, this is what it means for it to be community-led. We can't be saying, this was outside of the process when that is the actual process. So what we've heard a lot in that is, in order to do that, we have to redefine the definition of who is an expert. So we sit and say, because we're sitting at the research seat or the academic seat, that we're the experts. But when you're talking about communities that have not been represented, those who have not had a voice are the experts. They are the expert of their own health, of how they navigate the system, of their opinions. We might, when we're speaking in this realm, be the expert in the actual kidney donation or in nephrology, but there's still a value for all of the information. And part of why we haven't previously been able to gather certain information is because people's value and their viewpoint, it doesn't come to the surface. And so that's one of the things that we have to redefine when we're doing this research, and ensure that representation exists, again, on every level. And And so when I put this word, I know this is kind of simple how I laid it out. When I say reciprocity, it's again that we're not saying, okay, we want to find out what this problem is so that we can go publish a paper or we can do, etc. What is it that we're actually giving back? How will it help all of us in the end? So yes, obviously the goal is to increase or decrease the health disparities, but what else can it give to the broader community? So in doing this, we've spoken about some of the ways we've done it before. We're moving more towards a qualitative approach, meaning, it's not so much only about the numbers. Often, especially when we're talking about marginalized communities, racialized communities, these are people that might be in the Canadian context in a numbers minority, but it doesn't diminish the value. When we look at specifically like in the Black community, this is about like 3.9% of the population. If we were only looking at this from a numbers point of view, it wouldn't make sense to delve this deeply, but we understand that it's not about numbers. Helping those who are the most marginalized helps everybody. So our approach is, how do we hear the voices in a more detailed way that we can understand why these problems are existing. So this approach it's more about feelings and perceptions. These things are not the auxiliary. These are not just, oh, well, this is how people felt about it, but this is what's happening. That is the core of the information. So we're trying to find out, so why are people, how are they experiencing the journey? How is it that this impacts how they comply to what's given to them? What are their beliefs that see how they adhere to each part of the clinical pathway? And this is what's important in this information. So in order to do so, we kind of have all spoken about this branch of the project, the action project. So we were looking at 3 different cohorts, 3 groups, in order to understand this. Because for us to only speak at people who are already in kidney failure, already needing a transplant, it doesn't give us the whole picture. In a very, very broad sense, everybody really is a potential donor or responsible for having these conversations. In this context, this is a model for a lot of disparities that we see across the board. So we're looking at, what is it that people believe about health? What are they feeling? How are they feeling marginalized? What are there things in the system that we can change to better that? So in order to understand this conversation, we're looking and speaking with general community members. So as we mentioned before, the South Asian community will be looking at in BC, and we're focusing more on Ontario and African, Caribbean, and Black communities. And so we're starting along the whole continuum to see, what do you understand about this? What are the conversations that are happening in our communities when you're not in a clinical setting? We're speaking to frontline healthcare workers that are from the community also, because it's an intersection that's a little bit interesting. You have a different viewpoint of how those in your community are being treated, how you yourself feel a different burden, or how you're being treated working in this field, or what your recommendations are. And then we speak directly to those who have lived experience. So whether you're a patient, whether you're a donor, whether you're a caregiver. And each of these viewpoints are another little piece of the puzzle work to understand all the numbers that we saw previously, why we're seeing these gaps. The goal out of this is to find out what of these points are modifiable. We know that there's things that might not, we will never get to, there'll be a 0% gap, or nobody will have kidney disease. We wish that we could make this happen. But the goal is that it will happen at an equitable level. Like this, the disparities are not because of things that we can modify. It's not because of social determinants, or because of racism, or because of systemic problems. If we're seeing gaps, we want to know that we have done everything to remove these other barriers, and those gaps exist for justifiable reasons. So within our groups, it's been very interesting. We know, as we said before, we've been using these broad topics, like these broad groups of white or Black or South Asian. So what's really important for us is to de-aggregate this information and say, what does that really mean? Where geographically are you from? What do you identify yourself as, not what are we identifying you as? And so we're really making a concerted effort to try and reach out to as many diverse groups within these populations and have very intimate conversations, and create like a very safe place to talk about what their experiences are in healthcare on a whole, and what their knowledge is in transplant and kidney donation. It's been very, very interesting to try and to gather this. As it's been alluded to before, there's a lot of factors of whether people want to speak and how transparently they were. And in our situation, I think there's a lot of underlying mistrust of the system or in general that makes it very difficult to kind of get into the community and have these conversations. So a lot of time and effort is built into saying, who is going to own this data? Why is it being done? And how are we going to help one another? And it's a big part of the process. And I think when we even speak about community work, it cannot be led by an institution. We're we're going in and saying, we are trying, tell us what is that you need so that we can help one another. So that's part of what our focus is and who we're speaking to. And so, just to kind of, there's a few things that we've learned in this. And we've said it before over and over. In the first focus groups we've come to, almost consistently, one of the first themes everyone says is, we don't really, why are you doing this? Why are you here? How does this impact me? And it's very critical to acknowledge that and not to dismiss it, whether the intentions were right or wrong. That perception means everything in how we are able to have equal seats in order to share this information. The way in which that we address people, or we add on to how they already communicate and not impose on those systems, is very important. So, for example, what we realize is, traditionally we might send out emails or put up posters, etc., for focus groups. We found that, for example, we do WhatsApp groups or other forms of communication have been much more effective than what we would have thought or would have done in other communities. So it's learning and saying, okay, if that's how it's done, then we're going to do it in that way. That's more effective. Even with us doing all of these things, we know we're not going to have 100% community buy-in because if it's not initiated from community. So that's what we want to work on. So in this case, this partnership has been built from the beginning to say, we're building it from ground up, and it's not an institution coming in saying, hey, we have a problem, how can we fix it? It's we both have a problem. So for example, the Black Health Alliance mandate is to look at disparities across the board in health, and we're like, this falls within that, so how do we both work together to do that? And I kind of put the last line when I'm saying best laid plans, because even with all of this, with us considering these things, there's the target keeps changing, the learnings keep informing our next steps. And there's things that we thought that we could have, preempted for, we would have been prepared for, and it keeps changing. And it's a wonderful process to kind of be humbled and to learn and continue, but that's part of the process also. So from the specific data that we learned. So as I said, we've spoken to groups from all of those three. And, so I just want to kind of put the disclaimer, this is not final. We've also committed to our communities that we will not be publishing or making final analysis until we've brought the information back to them. But we kind of wanted to have a teaser to say, this is what the conversations are happening, and this is what we'll be having going forward. So one of the things, the belief before is that there's a lack of knowledge. Some of the slides we looked at before, that there's a lack of knowledge and community around these conversations. And it's not necessarily the traditional sense of lack of knowledge as there is a lack of conversation about it. The way the knowledge is understood and shared is different than what we would have thought. And so you have to ask the right questions in order to understand that. Some of the groups we spoke about, they're saying, we speak about it if somebody in our family needs it, if we come to that acute moment. But outside of that, on a whole, our health and this information is something that's private. So why would we be speaking, about this otherwise? So sometimes this idea of lack of knowledge it's also a cultural context that this is not how information is shared. We don't burden one another, or this is considered very private to not share this information. But within that silence, it can create stigma around certain conversations because it's not being spoken of. So this is one of the things that we learned, that when the conversation is opened up, people want to know, but there was a true, when we say lack of knowledge, there's a true, it wasn't spoken of. It's not that it was informed and was not understood. There was an absence of this conversation altogether. And so in order to go forward, there's people who are saying, yes, we would like knowledge, we would like to speak more about it, but we need it to be community-led. So back to the idea of we need representation of who is sharing this information, how it is shared, so that it is felt that it's representative of those who are receiving the information. So what we found really interesting, just as a few examples, these were some quotes of some of the anonymous groups that we were speaking with. People said directly, we don't trust this system, we don't trust the data. It was very interesting that we would bring our own research that we've done, and they were like, but who did that? I don't believe that. What does that information mean? And so it was the idea that there's some things that we take for granted, that because there's been such a culture in previous of not being included and it not being community-led, we can't just assume now that we come in and say, oh, I have the numbers, I have the answers, we trust one another. There has to be things that we take as that those would be automatically comforting, sometimes can cause discomfort, and it's something to be aware of. And we saw that as a cross-section. A lot of people were saying, I've heard this story, this happened to auntie so-and-so, or this happened to someone in the community, and people have told us, not to sign the card or not to do this. People directly were told that because it was, this is what the stories become and they build because they're not seeing anyone that reflects them. That's a positive story. I mean, I think that's why it was so great that we heard that today. We're seeing positive stories, but this is not common that we hear these. And when everything else is put up there, it's not reflective of those who need to be having the conversations. And so a lot of people were saying, that has to be done, whether they're first generation, whether they're second generation. The cultural context of this is very different of how the conversation happens and how we're getting involved. And it was interesting how that, even though there's a lot of clinical information out there, that sometimes the narratives in community overrode those conversations. So like, how do we address both of those together in a respectful way that we can all kind of rebuild those new narratives? So it's been very, very interesting what we've done so far. We're kind of snowballing into more groups and speaking to a broader range of people, and again, trying to address diverse people within our community. And so our aims within this is to continue this conversation, is to take the themes out of what people from community are saying and use that to inform what our next steps are. I know a lot of projects like this, you would have a very clear, this is what the tool is going to be, this is exactly how we're going to carry it out next. But we are purposely being patiently listening to those in the community to say, based on what your needs are, what are things that we can modify so that the numbers that we were seeing before, where these disparities are, we can reduce in a true partnership. And we can reduce it by listening and not coming in with our own views of what we thought the problem was. I mean, we can't fix everything, but this is a model of, systemic problems that we can say we can create an environment that when you're coming to it, you feel more comfortable, you feel included, you know that your concerns are heard, that it's culturally appropriate and through a lens that the community knows that, this I was included and thought of within this. To address these ideas of mistrust that are valid, that they come from a place that there really have been systemic problems that have happened. So how can we ensure that this is changing going forward? And so our future aims is to make sure that we take this information, that we have very tangible information to give to say, at least within our practice, these are the things that we can do to address those and show that we respect and understand that and change attitudes from within. So I think our goal is, when we speak about education, is to first educate ourselves as healthcare practitioners and the system to ensure that these concerns allow for better interaction going forward. So that's what we have been doing, and I know all of us have kind of given you bits and pieces of the picture. We're still looking for others to contribute, whether you yourself are a healthcare professional, whether you belong to any of those groups, whether you have a group within the community, any of the African, Caribbean, or Black communities that you feel would want to have this conversation, have their voice heard, and be able to contribute to this. We're definitely looking for collaborations and partnerships from that avenue. We'd really, really appreciate, even if it's just if you think that we're on the wrong track of any part of this, if there's a way that you think you can help to the conversation, we're really welcome to kind of growing together so that it's collaborative even within our own groups. Okay? Thank you very much.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, everybody can ask a quick question.
Really quick one. Mm-hmm. Have you, out there in the community, have you heard of anyone saying, just talking about gout, for example?
I've heard multiple different things, not particularly. I actually find people don't know what's related to this.
Exactly.
Yeah, people,
and you know what happens? What happens is they have their own belief of what it is, and then they'll go and use an old wife's recipe or something.
Exactly.
Take this, mix with onions, and it's going to get rid of it.
You tie the onions to your foot. Everybody knows that this works. Yes.
Now, I tell you, when I hear that, because I have heard it from some of the folks out there, when I hear that, I say, you know what? Get to your doctor and start talking about uric acid. Right?
And I think that's the thing, we know what it is because we're in the system, but when we talk to the mistrust, it's that, we feel like these things that we've heard over and over, or we hear in community, we relate to it better, or we see people that look like us telling that story, that becomes your truth. So even if your doctor says it, you're kind of like, I don't know if that's for me. Nobody that looks like me is doing that. And so that's exactly what we're trying to address. How do we balance those stories with, okay, let's try and say, what is it really and how can we address it?